Among the greatest rock and roll artists of all time, Angus Young of AC/DC and Eddie Van Halen deserve a mention. Angus recently spoke out about his feelings for his bandmate Edward. In turn, Edward Van Halen revealed his feelings for the band AC/DC. The legends Angus Young of AC/DC and Eddie Van Halen of Van Halen are the band leaders of their respective bands. Because of their mutual influence, they have seen each other play guitar live and have met many times. Rumors have it that they are quiet critics of each other while simultaneously praising and admiring each other's work. Recently, Angus finally spoke out about his bandmate, and Edward Van Halen spoke out about AC/DC. Curious? Get ready to hear these two talk about their guitar playing, their bands, and themselves. Angus Young's early life. The birthday of Angus Young is the 31st of March 1955. William Young, his father, and Margaret, his mother, were both born in Australia but lived in the Glasgow district of Cranhill, Scotland. There were 7 older siblings to Angus. Cranhill has a reputation for having a high unemployment rate. It was William's previous job as a wheel guy for a rope firm that brought Angus up in Cranhill. After that, he found employment at a cement production plant, where he operated machinery. His dad became a flight engine mechanic for the Royal Air Force in 1940, just in time for World War II. Among his several occupations immediately following the war were those of a postman and yardman for a builder. In Angus's early years, he lived in Scotland with his siblings, who were all gifted musicians, while his mother, Margaret, remained at home to take care of the household. He has a brother named Stephen who could play the piano well. Margaret, his sister, was a talented singer and an avid music lover. Alexander was already well known for his talents as a vocalist, bass guitarist, and saxophonist. His other brother John was a talented guitarist. After that, George and Malcolm, his other 2 brothers, started a band. Malcolm co-founded AC/DC with George, who started Easy Beats. Angus began tinkering with the guitar when he was just 5 years old. After learning the ropes from Alexander, he was free to hone his craft. He honed his fighting skills on the rough streets of Cranhill as well. It's safe to say that they were musical people. The Angus family was able to escape the deadly Scottish winter by taking advantage of a company-sponsored relocation program that allowed them to settle in Sydney, Australia. In Burwood, Sydney, they settled into a modest home. From 1960 to 1966, Angus had the opportunity to attend Burwood Public School here. Ashfield Boys High School was his alma mater by 1967, but he left when he was 15 years old. Even in high school, he had a reputation for being a dreary student. He was the type of student who would spend his free time after school practicing guitar in his room, and he loved art classes the most. Immediately following graduation from high school, he worked night shifts, apprenticed as a printer, and eventually found employment with Rybold, a magazine firm. While everything was going on, Angus continued to work on his guitar skills. A 6-string banjo that had been restrung was his first guitar. Margaret, his mom, bought him an inexpensive acoustic guitar when he was a little boy. Near 1970, he finally managed to get his hands on a Gibson SG, a second-hand one at a music store conveniently located just down the street from his house. They claim that modest starts are the springboards to enormous achievements. Edward, the other guitar legend, has a fascinating backstory that we should explore in more detail. Edward's early life. On the 26th of January, 1955, Edward was born in Amsterdam. He was born in the Netherlands. He was raised by his mother, Eugenia, and his father, Jan Van Halen. In addition to being a skilled saxophonist and jazz pianist, his father was employed by the Dutch Air Force. His mother, on the other hand, was of Eurasian descent and is today considered to be of Indonesian descent. Throughout their life, Edward's family lived in Indonesia for around 6 years. Subsequently, they decided to transfer to Amsterdam, and then they ultimately settled down in the Magein, Netherlands. During this period, which was the 1950s, there was a significant amount of bigotry, particularly directed toward those of mixed racial backgrounds. Hence, his family was not spared from this. In 1962, Edward's parents decided to relocate their family to the United States when they were subjected to discrimination based on their color, although they remained in California. Eves H. and his brother Alex were able to attend a segregated primary school. This allowed them to continue their education. Because English was not their first language, They were considered to be one of the minority kids in the school. As a result, they were subjected to severe bullying from both white children and pupils whose first language was English. By the time Edward was 6 years old, he had already begun to learn how to play the piano. He was frequently observed traveling from Pasadena to San Pedro, Los Angeles, to practice and continue his education under the guidance of an elderly piano instructor named Stacy's Calvitas. Even though he never learned to read music, Eve H. was incredibly prolific in terms of learning and improvisation. Instead, he was well known for his habit of constantly attending performances of Bach or Mozart composers' works. Even though Edward's parents were more interested in classical music and desired for their kids to develop the skills necessary to become skilled classical pianists, Edward was able to earn his first award in 1967 by winning first place in the annual piano competition held at Long Beach City College. On the other hand, the guys experienced a significant improvement in their rock and roll musical abilities and were profoundly impacted by the British invasion bands of the 1960s, such as the Beatles and the Dave Clark Five. Both Edward and his brother Alex highly regarded these bands and had a deep appreciation for the musical style that they favored. Alex was a guitar player even before his brother began to learn the instrument. After purchasing drum equipment, Edward began trying his hand at playing the drums. Edward's passion for playing the guitar developed. Immediately following his brother's performance of Surfari's drum solo on the song Wipe Out, he handed over the drum equipment to his brother and began teaching him how to play the electric guitar. During an interview, Edward admitted that when he was a young adolescent, he would always practice the electric guitar by either wandering around the house with his guitar strapped on or sitting alone in his bedroom for long hours with the door shut. This was something that he did constantly. In the beginning, Edward and his brother Alex, together with 3 other individuals, founded the first music band that they called the Broca Combs. At Hamilton Elementary School in Pasadena, they would often perform around lunchtime regularly. Edward has always acknowledged that this series of performances is one of the driving forces behind his goal of becoming a skilled guitarist and a professional musician. He has always highlighted this as one of the motivating causes. Both his enthusiasm and his determination were really strong. The majority of the time, EVH would pick up records of outstanding performers at that time and would study practically all of the solos note by note, such as Cream's I'm So Glad from the album Goodbye. Because of this, he has always acknowledged Eric Clapton as a significant figure and influence on his personal and professional achievements. Edward Van Halen made a direct statement about his life being a representation of the American ideal on one occasion, which was in 2005, while he was giving a speech at the National Museum of American History of the Smithsonian Institution. Looking back, it is incredible to see how far he has gone since he arrived in the United States with just about $50 and a piano. At the time, he was unable to communicate in English. Both Angus Young and EVH are considered to be guitar legends, and it is hard to discuss their achievements and opinions without mentioning their respective bands. Let us proceed with that in a more in-depth manner. ACDC Band. Together with their other brother George and his music partner Harry Vanda, Angus Young and his older brother Malcolm were members of a band that collaborated on musical projects. It was known as the Marcus Hook Roll Band, as the band's name. Tales of Old Granddaddy was the name of the CD that they released. On the other side, Angus was a member of a local band called Kentucky, which had members such as Bob McGlynn, John Stevens, and Trevor James. The members of the band decided to go their ways after performing together for some time, and the band was then renamed Tantrum. Mark Sneddon, who was both the vocalist and guitarist, John Stevens, who played bass, and Trevor James, who played drums, were all members of the band. By 1973, when Angus had already reached the age of 18, he and Malcolm had already established the musical group known as ACDC. Angus was the lead guitarist, Malcolm was the rhythm guitarist, Colin Burgess was the drummer, Larry Van Crete played bass guitar, and Dave Evans was the vocalist. Angus was also the main guitarist. The name AC/DC was offered by their sister Margaret, who noticed the initials AC/DC on the back of her sewing machine. This led to the band's name being suggested. The band was responsible for producing their very first single, which was titled, Can I Sit Next to You Girl? Bon Scott, who was the band's vocalist at the time, later provided the voice for the song. Angus experimented with a wide variety of theatrical costumes, including Spider-Man, Zorro, Gorilla Wear, and Superman, to conform to the patterns and fashions that were prevalent throughout that century. After going through a lot of different options, he was finally able to agree on his famous distinctive schoolboy appearance, which was also something that his sister had proposed to him. It was reported to the public and the media at the time that Angus was born in 1959 rather than 1955. This was done so that his portrayal of the schoolboy image would be consistent with it. As a result of wear and tear, the same costume that his sister Margaret had designed is now in poor condition. To participate in performances, Angus was required to wear the uniform that he wore to Ashfield Boys High School in Sydney. During that period, ACDC published their first album, named High Voltage, just in Australia, on the 17th of February, 1955. Additionally, they issued a single titled Baby Please Don't Go love song. Both of these releases were unique to Australia. With the release of succeeding albums such as TNT, Dirty Deeds Done, Dirt Cheap, Let There Be Rock, and Powerage, AC/DC became widely recognized as a successful rock and roll band during the coming 3 years, particularly in Australia. The production of each record was a collaborative effort between George and his buddy Harry Vanda, who was also a producer. They entered a new era of success after the publication of their studio album Highway to Hell in 1979. This record went on to become their best-selling album at the time and propelled them into a new period of stardom. Several months later, Scott succumbed to alcohol intoxication and passed away. Because it appeared to be impossible for the band to function without him, this was a huge success for them. In a short amount of time, Angus and his other bandmates concluded that they should complete the work that they had started on their new album. As a result, they decided to bring on Brian Johnson as a substitute for Scott. To pay honor to Scott, the film Back in Black was released 5 months after his passing. The album went on to sell 50 million copies, becoming it the second highest-selling album in the world, behind only Michael Jackson's Thriller. It became an instant hit and an enormous success, selling far more than their previous albums. At the time that AC/DC issued their subsequent album, which was named For Those About to Rock We Salute You, they had already established themselves as the most well-known rock and roll band of their era. This stardom, on the other hand, began to wane with the release of their subsequent 3 albums, which were titled Flick of the Switch, Fly on the Wall, and Blow Up Your Video, respectively. It appeared as though they were in a difficult situation and had reached their breaking point in the 1980s. In this particular period, Malcolm was unable to tolerate the fall in their prominence, and thus resorted to using the bulk of the band's 1,988 Blow Up Your Video World Tour to address the issue of alcohol addiction. He rejoined the band after a period of self-isolation lasting many months and a period of feeling sober. During the time that he was absent, his nephew Stevie Young fulfilled the role of his replacement. Through the decade of the 1990s, the band AC/DC was able to regain their prominence with the release of their studio album, The Razor's Edge. This album achieved 5 times platinum certifications in the United States alone and sold between 10 and 12 million copies around the globe. Over the subsequent 10 years, they were able to release 2 further studio albums, namely Ballbreaker and Stiff Upper Lip. Both of these albums were enormously successful and assisted them in maintaining their position in the music industry. Black Ice was the name of the band's new studio album, which was released in 2008. Following the release of this album, which became one of their most popular albums worldwide, they embarked on a massive world tour. The album reached #1 in 29 countries and was certified multi-platinum in about 14 of those nations simultaneously. An album by AC/DC was published in 2010, and it was utilized for the soundtrack of the Iron Man movie, Installment 2. In addition to reaching #1 in a lot of countries across the world, including the United Kingdom, this soundtrack also reached #4 in the United States of America. The confirmation that AC/DC was working on their 16th studio album was made by Malcolm Young during an interview that took place in 2011. During the month of April 2011, Malcolm became unwell and was forced to leave the band. During May of the same year, their nephew Stevie Young was scheduled to take over for Malcolm in the recording of AC/DC's most recent record. By September, Malcolm had officially retired, and Stevie had been promoted to the position of AC/DC's official rhythm guitarist on a full-time basis. Malcolm and Phil Rudd, the band's drummer, quit the band almost simultaneously. Following their departure, the band's long-standing vocalist, Brian Johnson, was ordered by his physicians to cease performing music to prevent him from losing his hearing capacity. Because of all the difficulties he had as a result of his crewmates departing, Angus never entertained the idea of giving up, even though he is extremely dedicated and passionate. Instead, he has the resiliency to complete what the band had begun by themselves. In addition to this, he went to great lengths to get Axl Rose as a replacement for Brian Johnson through the remainder of the Rock or Bust World Tour. The band made the announcement on their official Twitter account on September 30th, 2020, that they were going to release a new album called Power Up. The record will feature Angus himself, Stevie Young, Brian Johnson, Cliff Williams, and Phil Rudd as members of the band's lineup. It wasn't until 2003 that the band was officially recognized by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They were placed number 72 on Rolling Stone's list of the 100 greatest artists of all time by the time the next year reached its conclusion. In the field of rock and roll music, there is little question that ACDC has left its imprint, made a significant contribution, and exerted a strong impact. Van Halen's band, on the other hand, is indispensable to the genre of rock and roll. Van Halen's band. In the year 1972, Edward and Alex, his brother, came together to start the band Mammoth. David Lee Roth became their main vocalist after he had been with them for 2 years. After that, the band's name was changed to Van Halen in an official capacity. As a result of its performances at well-known clubs, it became a mainstay in the music scene in Los Angeles. In the year 1976, the band performed the Starwood in California, which was hosting a music show. The fact that Gene Simmons, a bassist, witnessed the concert and stated that he was waiting backstage for the third song proved to be an astounding revelation. When he inquired about the band's intentions, they informed him that there was a yogurt maker who was going to invest in them. Gene pleaded with them to reconsider going in that direction and extended an invitation to them to attend Electric Lady Studios in Greenwich Village, New York City, to record some recordings. In the early stages of their career, the band recorded early recordings of their songs, including Runnin' with the Devil, after Gene signed them to his firm. Gene, who was enthusiastic about the band's performance, utilized his influence to approach Kiss manager Bill O'Coin and inform him about the band. However, they did not agree with Gene's proposal to sign the band to the management business. The contract was ripped up by Gene as a result of the discouraging remarks that he received from his superiors to acquire authorization for the band. Within the next year, Warner Records made an offer to Van Halen to deal with Edward for a recording contract. Even though Gene's plans for the group did not work out as well as he had hoped, Edward continued to keep in touch with Gene. In 1982, rumors were making the rounds that Edward was going to take over as the guitarist for Kiss when Ace Frehley left the band. However, Gene was able to dissuade Edward from quitting Van Halen. The albums that Van Halen released in 1978 were one of the most commercially successful debuts in the history of rock music. They reached number 19 on the mainstream music charts of Billboard. A great number of people considered it to be among the very finest rock and roll albums. As early as the 1980s, Van Halen had already established themselves as one of the most successful rock and roll artists of the era. After only 1 year since its debut, their album From 1984 was certified 5 times platinum. Jump, the band's debut single, became their first and only #1 pop smash, which resulted in them being nominated for a Grammy Award during that time. Additionally, the band was awarded the Grammy for Best Rock Performance in the year 1992. In 2009, Van Halen was placed number 20 on the list of best-selling musicians, compiled by R.I. Abele. The band had more than 56 million record sales in the United States of America and more than 100 million sales worldwide. In addition to that, Van Halen has had 13 #1 singles throughout the history of the mainstream rock chart on Billboard. In the meantime, the band is rated 7th on a list of the best 100 rock musicians of all time. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted Van Halen into its Hall of Fame in the year 2007. What was truly remarkable about all of them was the fact that Van Halen, as an individual, was praised for his guitar talents and the exceptional performances he gave. Nevertheless, what is it like to meet someone who is likewise considered to be skilled at playing the guitar, just like he is? Angus and Eve's first meeting. Eve had her first encounter with the Australian band ACDC on the 23rd of July 1978, when they were performing at the start of the Aerosmith concert that was broadcast on The Green Show. The occurrence took place during Van Halen's tour with ACDC. The two of them were performing at their highest level together, and the flow of their conversation was just as lively as their performance. When the two guitarists first met, it was immediately apparent to each of them that they shared a deep fondness for one another. There was an obvious recognition of Edward Van Halen as a budding star due to his unique tapping skills and brassy attitude. On the other hand, Angus Young, who was wearing a characteristic schoolboy uniform and playing a natural blues guitar riff, had already established himself as a rock hero. Before the encounter, there was a mutual expression of appreciation. The unrelenting intensity that Angus exuded and the way that he brought the stage under his control with his guitar left Van Halen in awe. Both the technical mastery that Van Halen possessed and the one-of-a-kind tone that he was able to create with his guitar were extremely admirable. The talk between them was realistic and quick, but it was crucial since it focused on the fact that they both had a passion for melody and the guitar. Their first encounter was not only casual talk, rather, it was the beginning of a relationship characterized by mutual respect that persisted throughout their professional lives. Even though they behaved in various ways, they were able to come together because of their commitment to rock and roll tunes and their guitar-playing talents. When Edward was sitting backstage in their trailer, there was a thumping noise coming from the stage. At that time, Edward was attending the performance. When he emerged from the building, he witnessed more than 6,000 people simultaneously bouncing up and down. Edward claims that he was taken aback and stood on the side of the stage while he contemplated whether or not his band would be performing after those other individuals. After that, Edward established himself as a major fan of AC/DC. On the other side, Angus Young was the one who first saw Edward in a video clip that was broadcast on television, namely the film of the explosion. It was the same sensation that he had when he first heard about Jimi Hendrix, he thought to himself, as he pondered the origins of the musician. It was incomprehensible to him, and regardless of the circumstances, he would always praise Jim for not being from this planet. At an early age, Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, and Jeff Beck were the guitar players that Angus looked up to the most. Then, however, Edward published Eruption, and he completely altered the course of events, as everything and everyone instantly started purchasing guitars that were identical to the type that Edward had introduced. People desired to play in the same manner as him, to acquire his tone, and to sound like him. After some time, Edward's sound became quite common, and businesses began producing equipment that would sound similar to Edward's. It was more like everyone knew about EVH and craved to be like him. Interviews have been conducted with the legends on a few times, and they have been asked about their feelings for one another. The time has come to listen to what Angus has to say about EVH. Angus says about EVH. When Edward came along, Angus had always admitted that he was a true innovator, just like Jimi Hendrix. This is something that Angus has always admitted was true. Angus considered Edward to be a guitar wonder. He was able to transform the standard of the guitar from what it had been in the past, and his style had a significant impact on a great number of people. Angus recalls that during those days, every guitar player he encountered asked him if he had heard about EVH, and his response was always that EVH was fantastic. Angus's response can be found in the following sentence. Angus remembers that the phone rang at 2 o'clock in the morning on a particular night while he was in the year 1980. He was so exhausted that he needed to wake up and get some rest. Amid his efforts to get to sleep, he became aware that his wife had picked up the phone and was engaged in a conversation with another individual. It had been a while since they had tied the knot. Following her decision to pick up the phone, he overheard her conversing with another individual, most likely in Dutch, given that she is of Dutch descent and hails from the Netherlands. Document a time that AC/DC was performing in the Netherlands, she was introduced to Angus Young by Adrian Vandenberg, who himself was a friend of hers. When Angus was called at that hour of the morning, he thought to himself that the person must be a close friend because they had called him at that time. Right away, his wife handed him the phone and introduced him to Eddie, saying, "This is Eddie. Anguish. He has something to say to you about something." EVH received a response from him in which he confirmed what he had stated, but he also brought up the fact that it was 2 o'clock in the morning. However, when discussing Van Halen, Angus Young did not always have a positive attitude all the time. This happened once, during an interview that took place at Donington in 1984, when he made a veiled reference to Van Halen by referring to them as a pop band. This was in response to a question about whether or not there was any competition between AC/DC and Van Halen. He responded by stating that his band is more of a rock and roll band, whereas they are more of a pop band. However, both fans are aware of the fact that both bands perform more rock and roll music than what is considered to be pop music. The most important thing to note is that in the video, it is evident that first, Angus says that there is no rivalry as if he doesn't care, but then he goes on to make a negative statement about Van Halen with the statement, "As far as Angus is concerned, it was his brother Malcolm who helped Edward develop a close friendship with him. Malcolm was someone that Edward enjoyed spending time with. In the past, after each show, they would make their way to the bar to enjoy a drink. In addition, Edward enjoyed going out with Brian Johnson and engaged in darts competitions. Malcolm Young, a member of the band ACDC, was mentioned by EVH as one of his favorite guitar players during an interview." EVH thought on ACDC. Angus Young of AC/DC and Eddie Van Halen of Van Halen are two of rock and roll's most iconic guitarists, and this episode represents a watershed moment in their long-standing relationship. Before the main event of the festival, AC/DC, Van Halen had performed as a special guest at Monsters of Rock. Angus was slammed by Edward for being a crazy guitarist after Edward ended his concert. Angus was taken aback and unsure of his reaction. The same effusive compliments from a guy he had loved so deeply shocked him. Meeting Angus genuinely thrilled Eddie Van Halen, who, as usual, was brimming with energy and enthusiasm. As his signature grin stretched across the address, Eddie grinned. Then, symbolizing the start of a wonderful friendship, he embraced Angus tightly. Eddie, Angus recollects, spoke far more rapidly than he did. His love of music and life shone through in every note. It was a surprising and humbling event for Angus to hear Eddie praise his guitar playing. Angus may have been a top guitarist back then, but he never considered himself a very talented musician. He was just an impromptu performance. But even so, the praise from someone he loved so much, Eddie, meant a lot to him and the AC/DC band. Both Eddie Van Halen's guitar playing and his admiration for other artists were well known. Tony Iommi's Into the Void, Eric Clapton's Sunshine of Your Cherish, Ritchie Blackmore's Burn, and Eric Clapton were among the guitarists he frequently mentioned in interviews. Eddie concluded by mentioning Malcolm's role in AC/DC's Depressed Remittance Blues. Because it demonstrated Eddie's deep admiration for Malcolm's rhythm guitar abilities, his decision was very noteworthy. EVH loved Malcolm's ability to effortlessly create such strong melodies and thought his playing was the foundation of AC/DC's sounds. Whenever AC/DC performed in California, Eddie would make it a point to stop by. Though they were quite different, the songs that Van Halen and the AC/DC band played together stayed the same, showing how much respect they had for one another. Stories of their legacy and distinct crafts remind us of the joy and integrity that music can provide, and their engagement with rock and roll is significant. A tremendous void was created when Angus Young and his comrades embarked on releasing an album in memory of AC/DC's late members. After Malcolm's death in November 2007, the rock and roll music business lost a significant figure. Recalling Malcolm as the heart and soul of AC/DC, renowned Van Halen guitarist Eddie Van Halen pays tribute to his buddy. Eddie remembers the time he and Malcolm were together on the Continental Tour of 1984 as one of the best moments in his life. He felt very sorry and offered condolences to Malcolm's family, bandmates, and friends. 3 years later, on the 6th of October 2020, Eddie Van Halen's sudden death brought back great shock in the music industry. It was particularly sad for everyone who had met Eddie, according to Malcolm's brother and lead guitarist of AC/DC Angus Young, who expressed how much of a loss this was. Friends and family of Eddie also received Angus's sympathetic ears. A watershed moment in rock and roll's history occurred when Malcolm Young and Eddie Van Halen passed away. Their impact on rock and roll music would last for generations to come, since these groups of guitarists were not only masters of their instruments, but also role models for other artists and fans throughout the globe. The fact that Eddie Van Halen and AC/DC are so close shows how much respect and appreciation there is among legendary performers. Van Halen's soaring solo stood in stark contrast to AC/DC's inherent heavy riffs, illustrating the stylistic differences between the two bands. Despite the seeming animosity between the two groups, Angus's comment revealed a deep devotion to their crafts and a mutual love of rock and roll. Like, subscribe, and click the next video button on your screen if you liked this one.